Welcome to the Chamber Leadership Alliance and today's Chamber Leadership Development Program training.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Akriti Rana, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the program manager of the Chamber Leadership Alliance, and today I'd like to welcome you all to the Chamber Leadership Development Program on Leadership and Chamber Governance, a Board Perspective. It is such an honor to have you here with us today. And before I welcome our facilitator for the discussion today, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and all the CLDP recordings and presentations will be uploaded on the CLA website after the webinar series on leadership and chamber governance ends on August 25th. We encourage you all to share the recordings and presentation with your fellow chamber leadership. Also, please use the chat and Q&A functions on the Zoom platform for any questions that you may have today. These questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the program. Also, thank you all to those who filled out the post-training survey for today's program. Please be sure to fill out the pre-training survey for today's program. Please be sure to fill out the post-training survey as well, which you will all receive in your inbox. And lastly, we would like to welcome you all to join us at the CLA Coffee Connection, which is an optional 30-minute networking event at the conclusion of the panel discussion. The link for registration will be shared in the chat box below shortly. Now, I'd like to welcome our facilitator for the day, Mr. Jason Ray. Jason is the president and CEO of the Wisconsin LGBT Chamber. He is the vice president of affiliate relations at NGLCC and is also a board member of several boards. And Jason, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Kriti, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us this morning. As Kriti mentioned, my name is Jason Ray, pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of today's conversation. For those who have joined us the past few weeks, we started about 2 weeks ago, really focused on the basics of board governance, kind of understanding some of the responsibilities that come with board service and the difference between board and staff. Last week, we had a really great conversation with a number of staff members of chambers across the country, hearing about their experience and learning firsthand what has worked and what hasn't. And we're excited to continue that conversation today with several board members of chambers across the country and hear from their perspective of what's working and get advice from them. We do want this to be a dialogue and conversation, so we do encourage you to submit questions you might have as things go up. We'll try to intersperse them into the conversation. But before I introduce our panelists, we really want to get a sense of who is here and participating today. So we've got 3 quick Zoom poll questions that we're going to ask folks. So we're going to launch the first one here and encourage you to participate just to get a sense of who's in the room. So the first is asking, are you a staff member or a board member of a chamber? I just want to see kind of where we are with our attendees this morning. We'll give it just another moment or two for folks to respond to our first question here. We'll close it out here in just 5 seconds. Perfect. Looks like we have a healthy, almost even balance between staff members and board members. So I think that's a really important thing for us as an organization to note. So we will try to make sure that we are addressing things that will help both sides here. The second one we have for you today is just kind of for those that have staff, how many staff members your organization has, how many full-time staff members your organization may have. This is really important as we think around board dynamics. Kind of the size of the board plays a major role in some of those dynamics. So we'll close this one out here. Great, let's look at the results. So about 2 to 5 full-time staff members for chambers. So a good mix, but really spread across the board from those without any full-time staff to those with some with more than 10 full-time staff members. So again, across the board here. And then one final one on board size, how many board members your organization has. We'll give it just another moment or two here. This information really helps all of our panelists as we try to address and serve the needs of all of our various stakeholders. So we'll close this one out here in just a moment. One more second. Share those results. So a wide variety across the board from some with 3 to 5 board members. In this case, a plurality of the 10 to 15 board members. So that helps give us a sense kind of who is joining us. So we thank you for that. But I'm really excited to move into our conversation here, introduce our 4 distinguished chamber leaders who will be a part of today's conversation. We've got Charles O'Neill, a member of the board of directors for the U.S. Black Chamber, Inc. Kurt Nguyen, who's a board member for the U.S. Pan-Asian American Chamber of Commerce Education Foundation. Raul Salinas, the general counsel and board member for the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And Tammy Wallace, co-founder and president and CEO of the Greater Houston LGBT Chamber of Commerce. So we thank all 4 of you for your time today. I know we've done a call in preparation for this, and just from that short conversation and time we had together, I know it's going to be a really great discussion, and I hope we can make it a conversation this morning. I know it's a little unique in Zoom to do panel discussion, so we will do our best. So we're just going to jump right in. And I would love to have each panelist, I only shared your name, but would love each of you to just share very briefly a little bit of just kind of your name and background for all of the attendees to get a sense of who you are. And we'll just go down the list with Charles.
Good morning, Jason. Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone that's on the call. Thank you for your participation in the Chamber Leadership Alliance workshop this morning. As mentioned, I am the chair of the board of directors for the U.S. Chamber. It's kind of a unique situation. I also am, my everyday job is I'm the president of the Texas Association of African American Chambers of Commerce, the statewide organization representing the interests of 25 Black Chambers of Commerce operating in the state of Texas. So I get the dual whammy, if you will, of being an ED on my day-to-day and then actually chairing the board of directors of a national organization that have the same mission. So it's not so much of a leap, but I think I was really prepared for that. And I'll be really quick on this. My first job in the chamber business was as a committee member, like many of you. And eventually I was in the newspaper, published a weekly newspaper at the time, and was elected chair of the Dallas Black Chamber of Commerce, which is parenthetically the nation's oldest Black Chamber of Commerce, founded in 1926. And I went to work for the chamber after being board chair. And so I got the bug. And so here we are, X number of years later, still in the fight for improved opportunities, access to opportunities for Black-owned businesses, not just in the city of Dallas, not just in the state of Texas, but across the country. And I started when I had a big fro.
Wonderful. Thanks, Charles. And I love the perspective you'll bring as both a staff member and as a board member. I think it really is an important distinction there. So thank you. Next, Kurt.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of this morning's discussion. I'm glad to be here. Always enjoy networking as well as sharing with other board members and alike. This to me is a very special treat. In light of COVID and whatnot, we are not able to meet face to face. So this is a nice substitute for that. So it's always great I'm calling from home. So, I'd rather be connecting with everybody face to face like normal, but this is just as good. A little bit about myself. I have been affiliated with US PAC for, gosh, almost 20 years. and it's almost about as long as I've had my own business. But just to speak a little bit, I joined US PAC and served on Susan. First of all, by doing a number of different things, I got involved with a number of her programs, including being a panel member, leading in panel discussions such as this before, as well as just growing over time into a board role as well. She has a great board. The folks there are just very dynamic, really have a passion to try to increase the share of voice for Asian American businesses. I've just found the experience has been a very rewarding thing so far for me. On the side, my day job, like Charles, to do something else, we actually, my company is called Kinexus, and I'm president and CEO. We've been around since 2001, and we specialize in a mixture of both IT, so doing cloud and mobile development, as well as actually marketing, communications, and support. Like many small businesses out here in the DC region, we're actually based in Northern Virginia. We do a great deal of work with the federal government. That's a lot of what we do. But in addition to that, I'm starting a new startup company. My background has actually been in technology startups. And so being a consummate entrepreneur, I couldn't help but just go back in there. And so recently we started up a new tech venture to develop, and we actually are marketing a product that's a emergency mobile application to help increase communication and promote safety for organizations such as schools, federal agencies, and organizations and the like. So thank you so much. I appreciate to be here.
Thanks, Kurt. Raul.
Thank you very much. Raul Salinas. I am the General Counsel for the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I also sit on the Board of Directors here in Los Angeles for the Los Angeles Latino Chamber of Commerce. And on the USHCC side, I sit on the governance committee and work very closely with the executives there on a regular basis. On a day-to-day job, I work at a law firm called Alvarado Smith out here in California. And I've been involved in the diversity and inclusion space almost since I got out of law school back in the 80s. I've been practicing for over 30 years and has really seen the power of nonprofits and have been involved in starting up a number of nonprofits, including one that I started in the 90s called the California Hispanic Corporate Council, aimed at promoting minorities into positions of senior management and above in corporate America. And very happy to be here with you today and look forward to sharing information with the rest of the panelists. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Tammy.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. Tammy Wallace, I am the co-founder and president and CEO of the Greater Houston LGBT Chamber. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I want to thank you and Kriti for organizing. This is a terrific panel. Really excited to be here today to participate. My background is as the co-founder of the chamber. We launched in 2016, so we're a relatively new chamber. But I have more or less been acting as the president and CEO since the inception of the organization, but that was actually official a couple of months ago. So we've now made this leap from volunteer to a paid CEO. However, when we get into some of the comments, I'll be able to share more about our hybrid background. That being said, prior to that, I actually own InFocus Strategies, an LGBTBE certified firm. We do public affairs, community engagement, governmental relations. My background spans from government policy, politics, to financial management, nonprofit management, and education. So I often say I'm not a jack of all trades, but many, and it has definitely served me well, and certainly moving into this chamber world in 2016.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tammy. And again, thank you to all of our panelists. I'm really excited to just jump right in and want to focus a little bit on kind of, what boards are up to right now. I mean, there's just so much happening right now, whether it's COVID-19, the shutdowns, fights for against racial injustices. How has that impacted, how have all of these events impacted the way that your board has been engaged in its work? Are there things that have worked particularly well? Are there things that haven't worked well during this time? How have all of you seen your boards really engage in fulfilling their fiduciary responsibilities right now? And I'll open up to anybody who wants to start with that.
Well, Jason,
Well, this is Raul. Go ahead, Tammy. No, go ahead, Tammy.
I'll just share a few quick thoughts. One, our board has gotten more engaged in direct outreach to the members. We've asked them to help through calling all our members, checking on them. They've really taken that to heart in terms of trying to capture what's going on with our members, bringing information back about the stories and challenges they're having so we can try to assist. The other piece of that, we were already on the path to officially hiring me as the president and CEO, but this was, the board felt like even more so the right to do that because we needed solid leadership and continuity as we move through this crisis.
Yeah, Jason, I think it's important to help support the board by bringing in folks from the outside who are on the front lines to the extent that the board doesn't have those. It's important, I think, to bring in some of the first responders, whether it's in government, law enforcement, community activists, those that can share additional insight about where the economy is trending and how that all the things that are affecting us with COVID-19, with Black Lives Matter, with massive unemployment, with the PPP programs out there. I think it's important to help encourage that level of communication, to educate the board, and to bring in voices from the outside into the boardroom to help guide the organization in the right direction as we face this new normal.
That's great. Thanks for others that want to jump in on this one.
Well, I think it's clear, just even by the fact that this panel exists in the form that it does, that it has allowed us to be in communication on a more frequent basis, albeit not in person. But again, running a statewide organization with 25 chambers in a state that's the size of France, it's difficult to get 25 people in a room at one time, even at an annual conference. And so Zoom technology has allowed us to have fully attended meetings, number one. And clearly, again, with the national organization with 9 members scattered across the country. In fact, I'm saying this in the nicest way possible because I don't really mind. I'm missing a board meeting right now to be on this panel. So it's a Zoom meeting as well, right? So I think the ease of communication has really allowed board members to focus because they're not distracted, because they've made room for it in their schedule, in their day-to-day. So it's a good thing.
Oh, Kurt, I think you muted on us.
I'd like to just comment on and echo on what everybody else was saying, and the fact that the economy has been affected so much by COVID, and so many chambers are supporting their constituents, which is a lot of the small businesses out there, us being one of those things. On a more practical matter, communication is even more critical right now. And so just the ability as a board to be able to come together and just provide guidance and support and encouragement to our chamber is a very key part of that, to ensure that the livelihood, the bread and butter, the people are still energized and are focused on the mission and do what they need to do unfortunately, in an ever-changing environment. We're not talking, necessarily weeks, even months nowadays. We're talking days. Things are evolving every day. You're hearing something new, and so we're trying to make sure that we can communicate with our CEO as well as to help them be able to ensure that, hey, today may be going down this path, but tomorrow may be something else. And so Communication 101 is actually coming into play for us.
I think that's a line I've heard from all of you. This is, despite these unique times and being distant, boards are engaged more in some regards on a regular basis now than they were previously. And how do you, as a board, how do you keep people engaged, when there's so many things happening and things are turning, and that you're preventing them from getting either burned out, or that they have to focus on their own business right now instead of on the work of the board? How do you keep people energized and engaged right now during this?
I'll jump in. I'll say as I don't know if trite is the right word, as trite as it may sound, we've seen worse times. Certainly Black folk have, and so while this is a difficult situation, we can be encouraged by the experience of having endured to this point. And so, staying the course is just a part of doing business, number one. There are going to be some cycles that all businesses and all organizations will go through, but putting the best light on it and remaining hopeful is just to look back and see what you've come through to get to the point you are today. We'll be okay.
Jason, I would say that the way to keep board members engaged is to make sure that we're using them in a valuable manner. I mean, I think most people will participate on a board because it speaks to them, that it addresses a passion that he or she may have in serving on that board. And what we look for the board member, I think, are four things. We look for access that they bring to the board. We look for their expertise. Another word for that is judgment. How do they address those things? What skill sets do they bring from their own industries that are of value to the organization? We certainly look to them for fundraising and helping with the finances of the organization. And most of all, we look for them for involvement. And the quickest way, I think, to losing a board member's interest is to give them the impression that all of those traits that they possess are not being utilized there. And so I would say to you that in a great organization, the life span of a board member should be a couple of years, certainly not more than 3 terms. I would say 6 years is generally a good rule of thumb there. So you got them for about 6 years. Some organizations have shorter terms, some have longer terms, but at some point that board member is going to have board member fatigue of serving with the organization, despite the passion that they may have. It's just they need to get a break from the organization. And I think while they're there, before they get to that point, I think we should ask them, is your interest being served? Or is your passion that brought you here, is that being achieved? And if it's not, we ought to do something about it to get them engaged and keep them involved.
Jason, I would share, we've done, along with those calls, because our board members really wanted to figure out how they could help. And one tactical thing that we've done to keep them engaged is, as we rolled out far more Zoom, events than we were having previously, we've actually engaged them to help moderate some of our events, which they're very much enjoying. It takes some pressure off of me to have to do every event. And it also helps them engage with our sponsors for the event, as well as, any separate speakers, et cetera. So I think, very, very tactical, but that's definitely helped in terms of keeping them engaged. We've also, we're doing 2 things. We're we're using this time to actually highlight and do board spotlights. We have a relatively new makeup of our board since last year and the earlier part of this year. So we have them, sharing and filling out chamber blogs, so we can actually highlight not only their background, their experience, but why they're involved in the chamber as well. And those things too are certainly helping. And then on a side note, picking up the phone and calling them and soliciting advice. I talked to most of them on a frequent basis just to get some feedback, whether it's tactical strategy, looking at what we're doing going forward. And then we've, of course, maintained our regular board engagement. Who knew we could meet via Zoom? Boy, this is, and it's actually working pretty well. So.
Hey, Jason, this is Kurt, and I just want to echo again what everybody's saying. I think from my vantage point, since I have a small business as well, and I'm not immune to board fatigue. So the key thing that I think that has worked well for us is, from my perspective, is just trying not to get too mired in all the day-to-day issues and problems. And so I think Susan has done a very, very good job in trying to use me judiciously where she believes that I can provide the most value to her. She seeks my counsel and I provide recommendations as needed. And so this is just a communication, just some thought for all the audience members that's out there, is that yes, you know, board fatigue is real and it's there. And so if we could be used in a way that most effective to the organization, and I love to serve and I love where I love the chamber that I'm supporting, but at the same time, I'm not immune to that because I also have a day job.
That's a really great point. I think when we start thinking about that, it leads to a conversation here around kind of a bit around board and staff interactions as well, because you talked, Kurt, there a little bit about the management piece versus the governance piece. And I think when it comes to these times, how do you as boards really help build that mutual trust with, you know, an executive director or a CEO, you know, for an organization? How do you build that healthy relationship?
Well, I'll just philosophically, you know, I'll just be very practical. I do best. I work well when I like the people that's on the board with me. So I think fostering healthy, positive relationships, not only in the board meetings, but even outside of that, has always been helpful to understand, you know, hey, there are other board members and this is kind of what they do. And I think when we meet, usually in our annual meetings, there's usually a lot of time that Susan has provided us just the opportunity to network. And since then, I've actually been able to develop relationships outside of just the board meetings. And so knowing who they are and where their backgrounds are gives me a better perspective of not only how to help my board, but also to actually help my other board members as well. There's been things that, you know, I've extended advice given my business as well. And so that has, for me, created mutual healthy sense of respect and trust in that.
That's great. Are there others that want to chime in on that?
Well, for those organizations that are mature enough and healthy enough to actually have got to the point of hiring someone to affect the day-to-day operations of the organization, I'd hope that the board would have been actively engaged in the hiring process, number one, and feel comfortable enough with that person that they engaged to let them do their job. You hired them for the specific purpose of relieving the board from day-to-day operations. And so it's critical that the board be attentive during the hiring process, again, when you get to that point of being able to afford good help. But I think that does change the dynamic in the organization, and board members need to understand where board responsibilities begin and end, and staff responsibilities begin and end. And so I think when you're at the point that you can afford to have day-to-day staff, you need to let them do their jobs, and you go about doing the things that support the ongoing mission of the organization.
Yeah, I agree with Charles. I think it's important for board members to stay in their lane, to understand that their role there is one of policy and fiduciary obligations, but that the board member's role is not there to run the organization on a day-to-day basis once they have staff. I also want to add to that is that I think for board members, it's important for them to observe the relationship between the board chair and the executive director for the organization. Oftentimes, if things are not going right between the executive director or the president, the day-to-day operator of the chamber, and the board chair, it's really an awkward situation for both of them, right? And there's almost like a miscue there, and you can't put your head in the sand and say, well, let those two of them work it out. I'm not the board chair, I'm just a regular board member. I think that's a mistake. I think it's important to make sure that you're giving your opinion in however diplomatic way you want to both sides about how that relationship can be improved and how you can work forward to make sure that the executive director, the president are doing his or her job, and that the board chair is, swimming in his or her lane and serving effectively as a board chair without crossing into one another's territory. I think that's how you build trust, because you help staff understand that the board's active and they're into governance and they understand the things that and the roles that each person has in their respective capacities.
And if I could jump in real quick and just say that it's critical to recognize who is right and who is wrong in those instances when there is a collision between the board chair and the president, right? Because if the board chair is at board fatigue spot, he or she may not be thinking of the best interests of the organization. And it may be time to preserve the organization by keeping the executive director and finding a new person to lead the board. So that's, I don't know that from personal experience, but I do.
Well, I'll just echo what the other panelists have said, but I definitely believe that communication is key to building trust, open communication, strong communication, and frequent communication where that makes sense. We have a board that has very much, they stay out of the day-to-day, and that's certainly helpful as I work on the day-to-day, but very much engaged in thinking about what this looks like going forward in terms of post-COVID, just overall strategy, how do we remain relevant as a chamber. All of that, I think, hinges on the work that we do together, but certainly the foundational piece of that is communication.
Well, and I think when we talk about that, it leads to something that Charles started us with around when you are able to get to staff, how do you do that? And we know from the survey at the beginning here, we had a good mix of those that are part of all volunteer-led organizations. And I know Tammy, the Houston LGBT Chamber, just made the shift from primarily volunteer-led. I know there was some other kind of part-time thing. So I thought maybe you could explain kind of the process that you went from being, an all-volunteer organization to actually this year hiring your first full-time CEO.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we launched in 2016, and of course, in an all-volunteer role, we did have the incredible assistance of our colleague from the North Texas LGBT Chamber, Tony Vetta, who actually guided and helped us not only launch the organization, but about a year or so in, we actually signed an MOU with the North Texas LGBT Chamber to help do some back office operational aspects. Quite frankly, we were growing so fast that it was difficult to keep up just from a volunteer perspective. And we always joke Tony was being severely underpaid, but without that piece to help us move from A to B, we wouldn't be where we're at now. And then as we continued to grow and things just got too much for Tony to handle, because guess what, he had his own chamber to run, we actually hired some executive administrators. They do association management here in Houston. This is their first experience with the chamber, but very much engaged with membership-based organizations. So we saw that as a hybrid to get us, from A to B, now to C, with them helping us to support that so we could work on growing the organization strategically until we could get to the point where we are this year officially hiring a president and CEO. I was acting in the role really on a volunteer basis, putting a considerable amount of time in. What I will say, almost 5 years later, is we know that's not sustainable. So any growing organization has got to have paid staff to support the work. And then also to make sure that we're delivering on those promises to our members. So we actually had, and we continue to engage a hybrid model right now. With me being the president and CEO, we still have our executive administrators on contract, and they handle all of the day-to-day phones, processing memberships, all of those just daily tasks, which frees me up to focus more on the bigger picture of things.
Are there other thoughts from panelists about, as organizations may be thinking about moving from all volunteer to a staff, do you have advice for them, or what things they should be thinking about or considering as they make that leap?
I'll start. Maybe it's because I'm wearing my lawyer hat here, but I think whenever you bring on a president or any staff of any level within the organization, you really don't know how that marriage is going to work out. You don't know if it's going to be a good fit, and without assessing a judgment on one side or the other, it really is like running a true business. And so you want to make sure that you manage those risks. You want to make it for a particular term. You want to be fair to the new hiree, and you want to set out really specific responsibilities and expectations. And you need to be very realistic about the time constraints and the activities that you're going to be able to accomplish with that first staff member or so. And then you want to be fair to them by evaluating their performance after about 6 months, when the learning curve time should be on the downward trajectory, and make sure that there's a good fit. Above all, you want to make sure that you're fair to them, because they are a reflection of the organization now. In many respects, they will become the face of the organization, and how you handle that situation impacts brand management, it impacts internal growth opportunities, and it impacts the level of focus that you can have to the day-to-day operations. The last thing you want is to have an employment-related issue that detracts from your mission and your objectives.
And I'll say that just like when we're counseling, if you will, a member business, we know that there are some things that make great sense. A good lawyer, a good accountant, good back office. So I want to underscore not just what Raul said, but his participation in this panel, because a good legal guidance as you move, as you grow as an organization is absolutely critical. I mean, we rely certainly on good guidance at the USBC. We're fortunate to have excellent counsel, as well as we do at the state level in Texas. But I don't think that you can understate or overstate rather how critical it is that you follow the rules. You've already taken the step of creating a not-for-profit organization. Uncle Sam is your partner, and it's easy to get out of shape. And without good guidance, you could wreck all the good work that you're trying to accomplish.
When you think of that, so we started with how you got there. One of the questions that just came in was, once you have staff, what have you found successful, either in really succession planning, either for an executive director or leadership change with staff, or succession planning with the board leadership as well? Because you talk about finding the right person. How do you plan ahead, and what advice do you have for folks to think about?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. I wear the hat, also the chair person for the board for Habitat for Humanity here in Los Angeles. And we have a 1-year term as a chair. Some nonprofits have a 2-year term. Some have sort of a term that just goes unregulated because the organizations aren't paying attention to the bylaws. But at the Habitat organization, we rotate every year. We have a strong nominations committee. We filter in the board members, and after 2 terms, they have to take a year off before they're even eligible for reconsideration. I think that that's how you keep it. You got to pay attention to the bylaws, and succession planning has to be real. For some organizations, having a chairperson serve in a capacity for 2 years, I think that's great. And some organizations can do real well with a chairperson that has a longer term. But I think the longer the term, the greater your risk of having some of the issues that Charles is talking about and others on this panel. And then you're not allowing for leadership growth there. If it were me, I would say that the newer board members have to be indoctrinated into the operations, put them on the finance committee, move them into nominations, help them understand what the, a lot of the evaluation of board members happens in the nominations committee, because they're the ones that are going to put forth the slate of leadership for the future years, and then have them figure out who there is demonstrating strong leadership that requires and suggests them move into positions of an officer and director, and then have a ladder that moves them up from the secretary to the treasurer to the vice chair to the chair, and have the immediate past chair stay on for an extra year, even if that means adding another term to their otherwise expired term, another year to their otherwise expired term.
Hey, Jason, I'd like to add to what Raul is saying, and everything he's saying is very correct. One of the considerations that I've found, just through my experience, has been even before you get into the succession, is the recruiting and evaluation of incoming board members, and I think that may be one of the questions may be coming up, but what are the qualifications and qualities that you bring in? And obviously, they need to have the passion for the mission, that has to be there. But at times, and I'm just speaking in general here, you may find some folks that may want to come in and they may have personal agendas. And so in many of these organizations, while they could be volunteer-based as board members, there could be personalities that could be coming in that could be in conflict with the overall health of where the board should be going as well. And so that's just one area that I've always tried to advise our board is to, in the selecting that, let's make sure we find people not only the right qualification, but what is their intent.
And absolutely true of board. And again, as you mature as an organization, finding staff. I like to think, and this is certainly perhaps not as true of other organizations, vital organizations. I often have to make folk understand that and again, this is very specific to Black-owned businesses. If Black-owned businesses are struggling, what do you imagine the helper organizations for Black businesses to be? I mean, they can't support them. So without corporate partnerships. And so, but my point is this: hiring good staff for little money is a challenge, and keeping good staff undercompensated is a challenge. So restocking the bench is something that you'll spend lots and lots and lots of time doing. And when you find a pearl, you got to figure out a way to get as close to their number as you possibly can, or they'll be using you for resume churn. And that's harmful to the organization as somebody getting stale on the job.
That's a really valuable point. Tammy, I see that you unmuted.
Yeah, I had one last comment in terms of succession planning.
Oh, you're muted on us, Tammy.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yep. One last point I think I would add is with succession planning, always important to you need to be adding new leaders and have a pipeline, but also you think about your strategy and going forward, what skill sets are you going to need? What type of people do you need on the board? And continually, I think that's a continuous evaluation. of making sure that you've got the right talent on the board to help you achieve whatever those strategic goals are. I've been on some boards in the past where you had a lot of people that actually had been there for a while, and while they were encouraging that the strategy needed to be, it looked like this, you didn't have the talent. In this case, it was the talent either in the staff or on the board to help you get there. So I gave them credit for vision, but they actually needed to bring the right people on the board to help. Once they did that, they were able to make some remarkable gains. So I think that's just got to be part of that succession planning audit, if you will.
So building upon that, I think that leads us into a great segue here around board membership. And I know Charles started on this. I know talked about the fundraising piece of board members having to be engaged in that. I know Raul mentioned the access, expertise, fundraising, and involvement. So when you think about new board members, what do you look for? What qualities are needed in a new board member? How do you go about finding those folks?
I'll start. I'll join in, Jason, on this. So I think you have to assess where your organization is. And so if you're a startup chamber, I think sometimes it's tough attracting the kind of board members that you are hoping to get, folks with a huge contact list. We used to call them Rolodexes. Nobody knows what a Rolodex is nowadays, but folks with an extensive set of contacts. And so if your organization is new or barely surviving, I would opt for passion and involvement over name recognition in the community, because sometimes people make the risk and they say, hey, I want to go after the Bank of America representative there, and that person may be on every single board, but they're overcommitted and they won't have the time to roll up their sleeves and get there in the nitty gritty and help you out. Sometimes it's better just to go with the up and coming person, someone that hasn't served on a board but has a tremendous amount to offer, whether because of the access that their corporation gives them, work for a major corporation, or maybe it's their industry that they serve, maybe it's the skill set that they bring, as Charles reflected on, an accountant, a lawyer, very important, a marketing person, exceptionally important. You need those folks to help guide the organization, but you need to understand, where is the organization in its own path of development, and try to find those folks that are going to be most helpful to the cause there, and make a conscious decision about, do you need a group of worker bees, or do you need some door openers? Because those call for different sets, and the ability to attract those people to some extent will reflect on how strong or well-known the organization is.
And stay away from the whiffums. What's in it for me's, man. That's, woo, that can hurt, and hurt for a long time,
Right, that gets into the conversation about conflicts of interest, and this is probably where Raul knows very much about in terms of the legalities of those types of things. And so, definitely there's always a challenge between what you want in a board and what you actually get, right? And so it's the balance, but you have to use good discernment and exercise, what is it that you really need, and how they really going to be able to effectuate your organization moving forward. And you may not be able to get the right, the star chamber team up front, but as Tammy mentioned, ongoing recruiting. You got to be out there continuing to recruit to find the best team to help lead your organization along with you.
Yeah, I just want to say something to encourage. I read somewhere in the newspaper that one of the best questions to ask during a job interview of a candidate is, did they play any sports in high school? And you want to look for the person who played in a team sport, football, cross country. And if the candidate is someone that played in a sport that's more individually performance-based and not part of a team, according to that newspaper article, that may reflect on their ability to be a good team player. That's a very broad brush to cast on anyone and on any player. But I think that what's important is to look for a board member that can work constructively, harmoniously, that has a history of being in an environment where they're a team player. Because if you do bring on a board member that is a WIFM, as Charles says, or someone that is doing it not because it's their passion, but because their employer told them that they have to get out there and drum up business, you know, you really need to dig a few layers down and make sure that the reason why they're joining the board and have an interest in it is because they truly have a passion in the organization.
And I would add, I think one key skill set is the ability to be a strategic thinker. I think to be able to connect dots at a larger scale level is really, really important. Early on, we had some board members, while very helpful in the organization, were very operational and tactical, and they got into the day-to-day. And so having someone that can really think strategically and connect those dots, I think, is probably one of the most valuable skill sets that you can have in terms of the board.
All great insights on that. So, you know, you think about, you know, you talk about the team player aspect, strategic thinkers. How does the board keep conflict out of the boardroom? I've been a lot of boards, and I can tell you they've all been just perfectly harmonious, and no one's ever gotten into fights with each other. All kidding aside, but they have. How do you try to keep that conflict out of a boardroom?
Well, Jason, I just want to call you out on that assumption. Sometimes you don't want to, right? Sometimes it's important to let that conflict play out, because that's a sign, in some respects, of good governance, right? If you're attending a board meeting and nobody's asking questions during that board meeting, you're not really fulfilling your job and your responsibilities in most states to act in a reasonably diligent manner, to ask questions that any reasonable person would undertake. And so sometimes conflict is good in the sense that it holds staff accountable, and it also holds your fellow board members accountable to making sure that things are great. And I think that, you know, if it's personality conflict, sometimes those things can be better handled offline. But if it's business, if it's operationally related, I think it's good to have an open dialogue. It promotes transparency, it promotes confidence, and it keeps everyone on their toes.
Open conflict is preferable to a sneak attack. If you got a disgruntled board member, believe me, there's conflict all the time. You just don't want them to take it outside and undermine the valuable work of the organization by some, you know, again, some subversive activity. And that's kind of a broad brush painting, but you don't want someone bad-mouthing you because of something that they disagree with at the board level. And so let it out at the table and get it worked out. And again, be mature enough as an organization to say, this isn't working, and get another board member. And so, but I think open conflict is always preferable to getting blindsided.
And I would add, you know, as Raul said, you know, conflict is going to be there, it's inevitable, but then there's healthy conflict and conflict that is not so helpful. And without a board that can sit at the table and have those discussions in an open and transparent way, you know, I've been on boards where that has been the case and others where it hasn't, and ultimately someone's had to leave. In the cases where you can have that conflict, everybody comes to the table talking about what the issues are and working to resolve, even if it's not everyone is happy or satisfied, at least with the direction, but overall they support the mission of the organization and they're willing to move forward. That's the kind of board members that you need at the table.
Hey, Jason, one thing I would also suggest consideration is, you know, obviously there's many board members consist of people that have vast experience in leadership. Hence, they may also have a lot of type A personalities on there. So dealing with all of that can always be very difficult. One of the things that I've always looked at in serving as a board member for USPAC is, first of all, you know, this is a servant leadership role. We're here to help advance this particular association or nonprofit. So at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about helping to advance the overall cause. And so at the end of the day, you know, it's not, I will advise and provide the best recommendation, be as honest as possible. But at the end of the day, it's, you know, it's not about getting my point across or you know, I don't gain anything from it. So this is about helping a US PAC or any other nonprofit advance their mission. So that needs to be a perspective that comes into mind in terms of just a norm about what would make good qualifications for board members.
That's great. And building off of all those pieces, one of the questions that came in here talks around the role of a board chair and what kind of the role of the board chair is in navigating the conflict, helping push the organization in the direction. I know we touched on earlier the need for the board chair to have that really healthy relationship with the executive director. But what, when it comes to kind of managing the board, should people look for in a board chair? What makes a good board chair?
You know, I'm going through this with the local chamber that I'm involved in, but, you know, I did search the internet, and I won't claim to have ownership over these things, but I think that, you know, it starts with having an unselfish interest in the organization's mission, right? Putting other board members before they put themselves. I think it's the ability to make time and a commitment to the organization. I think if you can find somebody that can inspire others and that you can find someone that commands the respect of the business community and the other stakeholders that are affected by that chamber, I think those are all good. And someone that understands the role of being a top-down policymaker and can inspire and direct and delegate what that means to the organization. And then lastly, I think it's important for the board chair to leave the organization stronger than when they took over by making sure that the board has a solid talent base of future chairs in the pipeline.
If you're fortunate enough to have a really, really strong, well-stocked board, it's probable that everybody's a type A. And that means they're hard charging. And again, in the best of cases, any of them could be the board chair in the best of cases. So it's important that the board chair be slow to anger in real terms and be willing to listen and I hate to say it, but almost Solomonic in the dispensation of direction for the organization at the board level. And everybody's there with the same passion that we've all described, probably with divergent views on how best to get there. But the best course is going to be, in the best of cases, the best of worlds, some consensus arrived at. And so if the board chair has to be facile enough, I think, to synthesize all the discussions around the board and come up with something that everybody can agree to, and then they all charge the ED with executing that they arrived at, the decision that they arrived at.
The other piece I've often heard for a board chair is someone who is willing to have those difficult conversations, that the board chair needs to be able to talk to other board members when they're not fulfilling their responsibilities, their duties, when they need to make those tough calls. You need someone in that leadership position who will really help stand up and make sure that and hold other board members accountable to doing their work. We have, I encourage our attendees to submit any questions you have. We do have one that came in that was asking, how are your boards approaching conversations around full diversity, equity, and inclusion right now? I'll open that up to anyone who wants to start.
Yeah, I think it starts at the top. I think it's important to make sure that the board reflects the diversity of the organization, of the organizations that the board member sits on. I think it starts with the nominations committee. I think the charge of the nominations committee needs to be to go out there and reach out to persons of color, to women, to all orientations, and to make sure that the organization is inclusive in that space. It's so important these days. And it's important to voice it at the board level, whether or not you're on the nominations committee or not. But I do think that it starts there internally, and then you work those candidates up through the process.
Okay, I'll throw out something. There's a study out there in 2017 by Board Source, and it's taught specifically about the need or the current satisfaction level with nonprofits and diversity in the board level. And so, probably not surprisingly, there is a lack, or continues to be a lack of diversity. And so there's actually, the survey noted that there's a high level of dissatisfaction in terms of having adequate representation and diversity in terms of just race and ethnicity, age, all the ranges, sexual orientation, all of that. And what they're finding is that actually is a hindrance to overall organization performance. And even more so, we've already talked about the need for, and we're all brought up very early on, for bringing outside expertise. You can't have that if you have such a limited perspective from a board perspective. And so that's an ongoing issue, and it's a great study that's been put out there by Board Source.
And I would add, we are a diverse board that we've had since the inception of the organization. So we've been purposeful about that and intentional about that. And yet we can be even more diverse. There's opportunities, and that's what we're exploring. But outside of the board, we're having discussions about what our programming looks like going forward, how we make sure that we have, every aspect of the organization, we're considering diversity, equity, and inclusion, and letting that thread through literally every part of the work that we do. I actually told someone the other day, all of our membership is established businesses with corporate partners. Another diverse aspect is helping entrepreneurs that want to start businesses, right? We need that level of engagement so we can also create an ecosystem here, an LGBTQ business community that includes startup businesses as well. So it goes beyond race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity as we see it, and making sure that as we look forward, that we support those goals throughout the organization.
Jason, I just want to add one other thing along this inclusion space is that, there's studies out there that shows that, for the first time in history, there are 5 different generations in the workforce today. And so when we talk about inclusion, I think it's important to reflect on generationally speaking, do we have adequate representation? Because those generations are much different. Today's generation is much different than the baby boomer generation that's on the other end of the spectrum, and think differently, respond differently. And I think the future obviously is going to be controlled by the younger generations. And chambers are well served to make sure that they take a look at those generational representations and include them as well.
Thinking around the board here, one of the questions that just came in is talking about political influence or connections that a board member might bring to an organization. Is that something that's important, to find someone who has political influence and connections? And if so, how does the organization utilize it?
I would say 150% yes. It's crucial for us in terms of our landscape here in Houston as we work, for example, to get the LGBTBE certification just recognized across governmental entities. Those relationships are important to even starting the discussions. We also, as as a chamber here in Houston, as a community, the LGBTQ community has largely been seen as sometimes the, activist community, and certainly we have a strong activist community in Houston, or a voting bloc, but we've not been seen through a business lens. And that's one thing that we are actively working to change here in Houston. So we have a seat at the table when it comes to economic development business. One way we do that is making sure that we have access to decision makers, and the LGBTB certification recognition is just one example of that.
I'm just reading here. Anyone else wanted to jump in on that one before I jump to the next one?
I would just say that, for many chamber organizations, being a policy advocate is extraordinarily important in getting out, and you add value to the chamber by weighing in on issues. There's so much happening at the small business level when it comes to employment, when it comes to sick leave, what you do in your particular state in light of the COVID pandemic. And small business has to be at the table. And oftentimes, even before you get to the table, you got to be, working behind the scenes before the matter even hits the table, right? To be very effective. And those kinds of relationships that board members bring that are refined and honed over years and years of involvement, those trusted relationships between politicians and the board members, those can come really handy in helping the chamber's voice be heard before these changes become laws in your respective states.
And Raul hit he hit my hot button. Chamber organizations are best when they're most effective as advocates for the members that they serve. And again, in the case of Black-owned, advocacy is the first pillar of the USBC's 5 pillars of service. Number one. If in the context of, there were literally laws that prevented Black folk from getting business, from doing business. And the need to unravel all of those myriad years of we call it now, we can generically call it systemic discrimination. But if you're not adept at how the sausage is made, here in Texas, we're weird in Texas. Our legislature only meets every other year, odd number of years. And so we're headed toward legislative session this coming January. And we expect a significant challenge to the state's existing historically underutilized business statutes. They have been watered down for the last 4 sessions with the express purpose of doing away with what is perceived by those opposed to be some special dispensation, despite the fact that Black folk, brown folk, gay and lesbian, and women earn collectively about 7 cents of every dollar in the state's spending. I don't know how that could be reasonably conceived to be some special dispensation. To do away with the very safeguards, if you call them that, that would enable improved access for ethnic minority and segmented businesses is a challenge, and it won't be met or overcome by making nice and just serving up warm platitudes. It's a real fight, and without the tools in your toolkit to wage that kind of battle, you'll be at a loss, and you will not be serving the businesses that you represent. And so advocacy is key. I think without being politically adroit, at least, it's a losing battle.
I love hearing that, because so many chambers that I've worked with have always tried to stay away from advocacy, thinking that that wasn't in their lane. And I couldn't agree more, Charles, that it should be front and center for how our business is. You are the business advocates out there doing this work. We're wrapping it up. We got a bunch of questions here, so we will not be able to get to all of them, so I apologize. But one that has come in a couple times from a few folks is, do you have any tools or successful ways to really get 100% engagement from your board? How do you get the board to be engaged?
Well, I'll just offer up something that we're getting ready to try just from this is very tactical, but we know some of our other LGBTQ chamber colleagues have implemented the use of Basecamp to keep board members engaged and stop emails from flying back and forth. So check back with us in about 6 months and we'll let you know, but we think that's going to be very successful. Very tactical suggestion, but that's one thing we're going to look at. We're rolling out, in fact, this week.
I would suggest normally, you want to set expectations up front. If somebody's going to come on to serve as a board, there should be a code of conduct that is set in place to spell out the expectations, and it needs to be enforceable, which means, if the board is going to meet regularly, they need to be able to participate in those. And if they do not, then that needs to be spelled out in the sense that, if they're only meeting quarterly and the person's not meeting, but only once a quarter, that's not going to be helpful to the organization. So things like that needs to be spelled out in terms of what is required in terms of participation, and then that needs to be tracked and managed and enforced.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things is, it's a little bit about get and give. And so, I think it starts at a very pragmatic level with enforcing the committee structure that's in your bylaws, right? And so when you do have board meetings, it shouldn't be the chair of the board speaking 90% of the time about what he or she are doing. What you ought to be doing is putting the board members on the spot who chair those committees to come up and report and step up. And if you think about that, if they do that, then they themselves are going to want to make sure that their committees have met in a meaningful fashion. So I think enforcing the committee structure is important. And then I also think on the give part, it's important to recognize folks, give them speaking opportunities, have them serve as the moderator for a breakfast meeting. Ask them, right? You got to ask them. Don't think people will just volunteer to do that unless you go out there and ask them. My sense is that if you set the tone right and you ask everybody to shoulder the burden in a little way, that the collective effort will yield maximum results, so that the organization's activities don't fall on the shoulders of just one person. But you also want to make sure that you share the spotlight, not just with one person, but with as many folks as possible. You highlight their involvement and you give them credit, speaking opportunities, and recognize their efforts. That's how I think you keep them engaged.
And have great sandwiches at board meetings.
Absolutely.
or a beer.
We've got time for one final question here, and this is a little bit more personal advice from folks. But I always tell my board that if I'm their third priority, I'm happy. Number one is their family. Number two is their actual day job that supports their family. And if board service comes in number three, I'm really happy. How do you are all out there running businesses. You are all engaged, but you're also doing board service. You've got other commitments. How do you balance it all? How do you manage it where you can ensure things are getting done and fulfill your board duties? What advice do you have for folks as they're trying to balance board service with job and family and other commitments?
Only do stuff that's important to you. If you're on a board just again to satisfy someone asks you to serve on the board, it's not worth your time. And so clearly I'm at a stage, I'm a gray beard, so I can kind of pick and choose the things that I say yes to. But if it's passion that drives you and it's something that can keep you engaged, that's a yes. But if it's just, space saver kind of stuff, don't waste the organization's time.
Yeah, I think that, number one is always going to be your family. Number two is going to be your work. Sometimes it's, for some people, those roles are reversed. And number three is sort of the personal side. And for some people, serving on nonprofit boards is their hobby. Their work in community service is what is their passion, right? For other people, it's hiking or doing physical things out in the outdoors, but you want to try to recognize those folks who really do see nonprofit service as a higher calling, as an important personal value to them. So if you can make it on the top 4 things that are important to a person's life, you know, you're pretty lucky to do that, I think.
And I'll just also echo, and obviously, you know, it's always going to be a challenge, right? But I personally try not to be on 10 boards. I only try to be on the 1 or 2 that is most important to me and aligned to my core value, what gets me passionate. And honestly, I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't fun for me. So when you lose the fun, then you're not going to be an effective board member. So it's important to not to do too many things, and so that you have a healthy sense of work-life balance, and like in anything.
You know, I'm not certain balance is probably the most appropriate word, but as we're all looking to achieve that. But for me, you know, when I got involved in the LGBTQ chamber movement, I found significant passion and connection to this bigger picture of what we can do, both as a movement, but here locally, regionally, and certainly statewide. So with that, you know, I think it's constantly looking at anything that I'm involved in. I have actually learned to say no over the last 5 or 6 years. I wasn't always good at that, but I have learned to say no. And I use now one criteria, and that is what I'm being asked to do, can I see significant impact? Can I connect the dots? Do I see, you know, what I call move the bar type of work? And honestly, 99% of the time, the answer is no. And so I have learned that that's my criteria. It's why I'm involved in this chamber. It's why I co-founded it, because we are moving the bar. We are shifting, and we are helping a community that didn't have representation before this organization came into existence. So that's what fuels me.
Well, thank you all for sharing that. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with our attendees today. I know I've gotten several chats here from folks who have taken so much away. So Charles, Kurt, Raul, Tammy, thank you so much for being a part of today's discussion. And thank you to all of our attendees. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with some of you afterwards in our coffee connection. But I'm going to turn it back over to Akriti for closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for your excellent facilitation duty, I guess, or whatever you want to call it. But thank you to all the panelists for your time this morning, this afternoon. And I would also like to thank all our participants, you know, for your enthusiasm and your questions, and always supporting the Chamber Leadership Alliance and our program so far. Again, like Jason mentioned, I would like to welcome you all to the CLA Coffee Connection, which will start, you know, shortly after the session ends. For registration, the link was shared or has been shared with you all in the chat function, in the chat box, and we all look forward to seeing you in our next event on August 25th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. For you know, registration, please visit chamberleadershipalliance.org. And again, thank you all for your time this afternoon.